And I viewed meaningful work almost as this mountain that I had to climb, and that one day I'd arrive at the top and, to use your word, like a light switch would go off, right? I would then have meaning. What can you do right now to make the job you have, for whatever reason you took it, feel more meaningful, as opposed to when should I quit this job to then pursue my passion?
Rachel, so I was going through your upcoming book, Manage What Matters, and this chart really stood out to me. So if you won the lottery tomorrow and could live comfortably without working, would you continue working anyways? So what I thought was interesting here is that 26% of people said that they would continue working and stay in the same job, where another half basically would continue working but would want to do something else. And then 17% of people said, heck no, no more work for me. So what is it, especially that 26% that would stay in their current job even if they didn't have to work? What is it that creates such meaningful work that somebody wouldn't want to leave?
Yeah, I find this 26% just fascinating, right? And when I initially shared these results, other people found this fascinating too, especially people that hate their job, right? They're like, who the heck are these people that would stay in their current job? And I think what's really interesting about meaningful work and about finding meaning in what you're doing day to day is that it differs by person. So what makes work meaningful for me might be really different from what makes work meaningful for you, JJ. And so when you look at these 26, this population of 26%, you have some people who are really junior in their careers, just starting out. You have CEOs, you have entrepreneurs, you have lawyers, right? I have some friends who are lawyers and they absolutely hated their job. So to then have a lawyer who would say, I'd continue working even if I weren't drawing a salary is just amazing. And it's really because, again, we're each unique in terms of what helps us find meaning. And so, for example, one of the things that we see that drives daily meaning is if your personal values align with the values that you're exhibiting at work, kind of the behaviors and values that you do day to day at your job. And so if one of my individual values is curiosity and learning, right? Like that's a top value of mine. And I work in a consulting firm where each month, each 2 months, I'm working on a different project or a different client where I'm learning all this stuff about a new industry or a new company. That might be incredibly meaningful for me. If I have if I have an individual value of creativity, right? I really value creativity. And I'm working in a consulting firm where we use a lot of frameworks. We use kind of a lot of templatized approaches to our client work. That job's not going to have much meaning to me. So it's really, one of the key things is how do we align our personal values with the values and behaviors we have at work? And that's going to drive different people to have meaning in different jobs.
One of the things you mentioned was daily meaning. What does that mean? Because I think one of the other things that you were talking about is it's not like a light switch of like on and off, I have meaning in what I'm doing for work. How does somebody think about, am I doing meaningful work on a daily basis?
Yeah. So let me start with a little story. When I started my career, I worked as a management consultant, and I had this sense that, one day when I arrived at the right job, my work would be
Hmm.
meaningful. So I viewed meaning at work, and I viewed meaningful work almost as this mountain that I had to climb, and that one day I'd arrive at the top, and to use your word, like a light switch would go off, right? I would then have meaning. And that's not how meaning works. Meaning works in the kind of the accumulation of these small daily moments that feel like they really matter to us and that they're really meaningful. And the goal, instead of kind of reaching this pinnacle of one day meaningful work, that's not the goal. The goal is, can my day be filled with more and more moments that matter and more moments that are meaningful? And the ideal is that, our day is chock full of them, and then our work feels like it has meaning versus, hey, one day I'm going to arrive and it's this binary. Um, and I think that's a really big aha moment for people when you talk about meaning, especially early in their careers, because they think like, hey, I'm going to make a lot of money early on and then I'm going to go do something I'm passionate about, and then that's going to be my meaningful work, as opposed to actually every day, every moment has the potential for meaning. And how do I optimize that? Because that's actually what's going to matter. Um, and it's really disappointing if you finally get to that job or you finally get to that career that you think is going to be really meaningful, and you arrive there and then it's not. And that's a huge, disappointment and letdown when it comes to how we think about meaning.
A lot of people think once I get this job at this nonprofit, or I'm a content creator, or I can work remotely, or whatever that happens to be, somebody thinks, oh, I've got this. Now my life should be meaningful. And a lot of times, someone taking on that role or getting to that level they think is going to be meaningful, they're disappointed by it. So, what is it that
Yeah.
causes that disconnect for somebody where, they've thought they've reached what would be their purpose, their meaning, and it doesn't quite work out?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because what we see is that sometimes those roles or those jobs that we think are going to have the most meaning, because they're jobs that, for example, have like a really important social mission or a really important social impact, or, make a difference in the world, that sometimes those jobs are the roles that feel most meaningless. Um, and that's for a couple of different reasons. So, first is when you're working for an organization or doing something so lofty, right? And that like lofty mission is front and center all the time. And your director, your CEO, or your leader always talks about, hey, we have this huge mission that we have to accomplish. Um, what ends up happening is that when that mission is front and center, when you're then as an employee doing the really tedious, mundane tasks that we all have to do on our job, right? Everything from, you know, scheduling a meeting or filing an expense report or, developing a chart. Um, because it's in contrast with such a lofty, important mission, it makes those mundane tasks feel even more meaningless, right? Where you're like, oh, there's people in my organization. The most famous research around this was around NASA astronauts. There's like, oh, there's people in this organization that are putting a man on the moon, yet I'm filing an expense report. My job is so unimportant because it's in contrast. So that's the first reason why some of these jobs that we think we arrive at could feel really meaningless when we get there. The second reason that I see all the time, especially with nonprofit work, um, is that the leaders of these nonprofit organizations or socially minded organizations, they often rely on the broader mission of the organization as enough to give people meaning. Like, you should be lucky to be here because we're doing stuff that's so important, right? Like, so important to the world or so important to others. Um, and so what happens is, because they over rely just on the goal of the organization, they forget about these daily moments that managers and leaders can do to make work more meaningful. Um, so those are two reasons why when you arrive, right, it might actually feel really, really meaningless when you're at this job that you thought, for 5, 10, maybe 15 years, hey, when I get here, it's going to be so chock full of meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. And so why don't we go back a little bit and walk through a little bit of your career? Because I think a lot of times people also think of like there's this clear path if I do A, B, and C, and then everything will be great. Where I think where both of us are at right now with lots of twists and turns of making the right decision that moves you closer with each decision you make, but it's a longer journey than what maybe people think, and there's like lots of twists and turns to it. And how, if we kind of go through taking first job out of school, and then working, going back to school, and then to what you're doing now, how is that kind of twisted, how has that changed over time in terms of what you thought would be the best next step?
Yeah, and I would say it's not just a long journey, it's a perpetual journey, right? It never ends. Our quest for meaning never ends. We're always going to be searching, and it's human nature, right? The search for meaning as opposed to this achievement of meaning. Um, and I think about that in the context of my own career, where, like I mentioned, I started my career out of college in a management consulting role, which at the time I had no idea what that was. Just people were doing it. Um, and and at the moment, because I didn't have a lot of context or role models who were in that business space, I never quite knew like what was I doing there. Um, and so I always felt like, okay, next year I'm going to quit this job and I'm going to do something that matters, right? I'm going to quit this job and become a high school math teacher, or I'm going to quit this job and I'm going to go work at a nonprofit. And each year, kind of, I didn't do that, and I kept wondering, my job is so meaningless. Yet next year I'm going to do this, and I never did. I ended up going back to grad school, kind of also following the herd. That's what everyone around me was doing. Um, but then when I look back, kind of with hindsight, my first consulting job actually had a ton of meaning, and I just didn't realize it at the time. Um, so, for example, I was really, really challenged. And those are two things that we know drive like massive, meaningful moments in the day. And then I think the third thing, which is so incredibly important, especially as we think about Gen Z and the new way of working, is I was able to develop really genuine friendships at work in my first job. We were in person. We were a cohort of kind of same stage of life consultants together, and developed these like authentic, genuine friendships, not just relationships, but friendships. And we know genuine friendships at work are one of the primary drivers of if your work feels meaningful. And, so looking back as I think about my career, I was like, oh, actually, this job had a whole bunch of meaning. I just didn't reflect or acknowledge that those ingredients were there. Um, and so kind of my path and my journey continued. I went to business school, wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Um, Traveled abroad for a number of years, worked abroad, and then decided to go back into academia with this kind of idealized notion of being a professor, and like that having kind of just ultimate meaning of working with students and thinking, about important ideas and doing research and things like that. And pretty quickly into my PhD, kind of about a year and a half in, I realized that I hate research. I hate doing research. I hate data. Not that I hate data, but I hate like spending 7 hours in kind of a data set running regression analyses, which is kind of a massive amount of what a professor does in my field. And that was really a wake up call for me, right? In the sense of, hey, I have to find meaning exactly where I am, because this idea of striving and trying to achieve based on what the job isn't going to happen. Like I have to find it kind of where I am. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up spending much more time outside of my PhD working directly with entrepreneurs, with CEOs, doing coaching, taking what I learned in my studies around behaviors and psychology and in management to really work directly with individuals. And so realize that for me personally, and then this goes back to values, what I really value is making an impact through interpersonal relationships. And so I started to, slowly shift my work to be more about kind of individual relationships as opposed to big kind of macro changes, right? Like thinking about a corporate strategy or thinking about a research paper that, talks about in company acquisitions on a grand scale. For me, it's much more about the interpersonal. Um, you know, a lot of turns and winds along the way. There was a leave of absence from the PhD program. There was a startup. There was, a whole bunch of stuff. But kind of where I am sitting here, I think about what I think about day to day, because my job, like any job, has massive frustrations, a lot of tedium that drives me bananas. But I really think about, okay, what do I value? I value these personal relationships. How can I continue to bring those front and center um, at my work when I'm working with my students. And that's how I make sure, I keep coming back to, does my work have meaning? Um, so, lots of winds and twists along the way. And I often think like this isn't my final job, right? This isn't my final career, that there's going to be more twists and turns as my passions change, as what brings me joy changes too. And who knows what kind of 3 years from now it's going to look
So
like.
if you won the lottery today, would you stay in your job or would you do something different?
Well, I would, that's it. Yeah. I was going to say that's a good question. That's one I've asked. Right now, I would stay in my job.
Okay.
Right now, I would stay in my
For
job.
somebody who's not quite sure yet, one of the things that I heard, and I was doing this as well, is like, when is it okay to chase after prestige, learning, optionality? Because I think that a lot of the decisions that I made in terms of like fighting to get into investment banking, getting an MBA at Wharton, some of those things are not maybe having an idea what I want to do or something, but it's like at some point of focus on, hey, I'm learning a lot, I'm meeting interesting people, I think this could lead to interesting further on versus um taking some like passion path or something like that, especially early in your career. Because I think that's one of the things that you mentioned with the however many years you were in consulting of looking back on it, I'm sure there were a bunch of things in terms of the learning, the connections, and all that led to a lot of things that you have in your career now. So when can somebody just be like, it's okay that I don't have this figured out, that I'm going after the prestigious job or whatever it is, and then how do you eventually find something that that has more meaning and is more aligned with your values and interests, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's a slightly different, I think it's a slightly different, maybe a slightly different question, because I think that, and I teach in a business school, and I teach a lot of undergrads who number one job is investment banking, number two job is consulting. Um, And I think it's less of, hey, it's okay. I'm counseling my students less around like, hey, it's okay to chase prestige, or here, let me give you permission to go after something that has status versus not. It's more of when you're in that job, and whether you took it for prestige or whether you took it to pay off your college loans, which a lot of my students, they don't want to admit, but the financial aspect is really appealing, and I completely understand why. Um, it's that when you're there, maximize the meaning you have in that job, as opposed to, again, like one day I'll quit this job and I'll go pursue my passions. So, how do you reframe, or how do you think about what that job is giving you in the moment, to make sure that it has maximum meaning for you at that moment? And I think what's sad, or what ends up being lost, is we have this feeling of like one day when we arrive will have meaning, and we miss out on kind of the moment, the meaning that we could have right there in that job, that we might have taken for prestige or we might have taken for status. And I think there's things like, we talked about values, and I think there's ways to say like, I value this. I value creativity, and maybe my job at the consulting firm doesn't have maximum creativity, but what are ways that I could bring creativity into this job? Because then this job is going to feel more meaningful for however long I do it, right? Maybe I only do it, maybe I'm only a banking analyst for 2 years, or maybe I'm only a consulting um, associate for 2 years. But in those 2 years, why not maximize kind of these moments that matter for you in your work? And so when I'm speaking with my students, I'm speaking with folks early in their career, it's more around uh, what can you do right now to make the job you have, for whatever reason you took it, feel more meaningful, as opposed to, when should I quit this job to then pursue my passion? Um, I think, anyway, I'll pause there. But I think I was going to say something about kind of the influence, the students who go into influencing and stuff like that. But I think it's about how can you maximize what you have in the context you have, because a lot of us don't have the privilege or the ability to follow our passion. And so that's a shame, right? If we think that only when we follow our passion will our work be meaningful.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to follow up with is from your book, and you've touched on a couple of times, but how can somebody figure out what their values are and what they're good at? Because I think those are two important things. Where, for example, there's this like I think it's called like the high five test, or there's like the strengths finders, where I did that maybe a year and a half ago, and realized that a lot of my day was actually made up of so there's like 20 items and they ranked them in order, and like a bunch of what I was doing was like the bottom five. And so it's like, how do I get to the point where I'm doing more of the things that I'm good at and I enjoy doing, and I feel that I have more of an impact. And so it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to quit the business that I built, but how can I make small tweaks to work towards those things? And so how does somebody find out um, like what do they value, and then how can that relate to work, and then
Yeah.
also what are they good at, and then how do they play to their strengths in whatever the job happens to be?
Yeah. And JJ, what you're talking about is something in medicine that we call operating at the top of your license. And that's where you're doing you're doing the work, you're doing the procedures that is the pinnacle of your training allows you to do, as opposed to doing things that don't play to these like superpowers that you've done. And so kind of the ideal job, right, is the one where you're spending the most amount of time operating at the top of your license. Right, you're really, you're playing to your strengths for a big part of your day, right? That's the goal. So one of the things, and especially with like meaning, we often talk about with like lofty things, and we can read philosophy and we can read Viktor Frankl and all this kind of stuff, but I'll let others do that. I really focus on like what's super practical to take to your day to day. And so there's there's two exercises that I would encourage someone to do if you want to identify your strengths and identify your values. So the first, in terms of values, there's a really simple values exercise that's super fun, where you kind of spend 15 minutes going through circling the values that you have, and then really importantly prioritizing them. And we want to get to about 5 to 7 of your personal values. And so you do this exercise, and then kind of written down, you have this set of values. And then you start to think about, okay, where are these values showing up in my day to day, and where can I bring more of them into my day to day? So again, I mentioned kind of I really value interpersonal relationships and kind of the building those relationships. And so what I've done is I've started to say no to things that don't focus on that, so that I can have more time to meet with a student for a half an hour or an hour. Whereas before I was just pulled in so many directions that a meeting with a student to talk about a career, it was impossible because I didn't have any time for that. So how do I reshape my day to allow something that's really important to me kind of become front and center?
If you'd like to go through the values exercise yourself, you'll find a link to it down below.
Also, kind of values, it's funny, I'm sitting at my husband's desk, and another way to bring values in day to day, he has his values written on these note cards, and he puts them, his personal values, and they're right by his laptop. And so as he's kind of in a meeting or in a Zoom, he can glance down and just be reminded, like, this is my personal value. How do I bring this value into this annoying meeting where we're trying to schedule when the next workshop is, right? Or something like that. So that's another kind of easy kind of technique to make sure that your values are front and center, and you're reminded of them. The
Yeah, that's really.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry,
No,
go
no,
ahead.
no.
No, I was gonna say that there's something interesting I found recently with Benjamin Franklin. There were like 13 virtues that he wanted to practice. So there was like a period of time where it's like today or this week I'm going to focus on this one. And so it's like whatever you're doing, like you can find a way to try to find meaning and portray or work on different values. And so, yeah, I think finding like figuring out what they are, and then figuring out, can I do that within work somehow? Can I do that in what I'm doing outside of work? Can I do that with my family? Can make a huge difference.
And yeah, and it goes back to one of the books I spent a lot of time with in preparing to write my book was Thich Nhat Hanh's Working, and he's a Buddhist monk that talks about how you bring meaning into your day to day work. And so much of it was was just mindfulness and reframing, right? Being super present, understandably, right? Given his given his belief system, and it's your mind is an incredibly powerful thing. So if before you jump on a call and you think, hey, I have a value of empathy, let me just remind myself of that. Let me glance down at my values. And then when you get on the call and you think about a conversation with a coworker where you want to start, getting into the tasks that you have, but your coworker's having a bad day, and you remember your value of empathy. So you spend 5 minutes listening. That might be the most meaningful part of your day and your coworker's day because you're reminded of that value. And so, kind of this idea of reframing and bringing things that matter to you front and center has a huge impact on meaning.
Yeah. And I think the more I get into things of like I've had a bunch of things just like not work out how I thought they would, and just being able to focus on that versus like what is missing from this. So there's like a bunch of things with the business I have now where it's like if we just focus on one of them instead of
Mm.
five, it's like, oh, that could have been $1 million business, but it's like I didn't have the focus and attention. And so there's a lot of more the hustle culture type vibe, which in some senses I agree with, of like if you do so much of this, like it's unreasonable that you're not successful. And so I think sometimes, maybe not to that degree, but it's like, hey, I made the decision to be in this role and this is what I'm doing. And what can I do to do the absolute best job to get the most out of it for myself? And like the good things that kind of comes out of that, if it's like a referral of your colleague to get your next job, or the pay raise or the more responsibility or those things, as opposed to the you know the hot topic from a couple of years ago around kind of quiet quitting, let's say, of like let's just do the like I'm stuck here, let's just do the bare minimum, and maybe I can get by and not get fired, or if I get let go, it's like it's not the end of the world. So I think there's something in that kind of the mindfulness, the consistency, the kind of chop wood carry water idea of like, hey, there's going to be things that are boring, that are this, but if I can learn to go through the things that are boring and get enjoyment out of that, that I'll probably find more meaning in life, as opposed to just being really upset of the things that are involved with the day-to-day of my work.
And that's right. And like that's the if we're talking about goals, right? Which I hate using the term goal in the context of meaning, but like the goal, right, would be you have this super boring task that you have to do at work, right? And when we work, there's always going to be these boring tasks. Even if we are operating at the top of our license and our work aligns with our values and we have our strengths up there, there's always going to be that task you don't want to do. And if you can find a little bit of meaning in that boring task, right? Like that's the goal. That's how your job becomes like completely imbued with meaningfulness. Um, and it is about like that. I had a friend call it once, optimizing the signal versus the noise in your work. And so every job you have is going to have a lot of noise, right? Like for me, it's faculty meetings and like bureaucracy and admin and office politics and all this stuff, right? That's like swirling around. The signal for me is my students, the impact I have on my students, and the work I do with like leaders of organizations, right? New managers, aspiring managers, leaders of organizations. So that's the signal. And my goal, right, is to optimize the signal and minimize the noise. And if I'm able to do that, right, my job feels great, as opposed to like letting the noise really override the signal. And when that happens, then I lose it, right? I'm like, I can't do this job anymore.
Yeah. And then so going back to the student that took the job, they're trying to make the most of that day to day, thinking kind of longer term, as opposed to like, okay, so I know my values, I know what I'm good at, I'm trying to incorporate that in what I'm doing. So your previous book on bringing up the boss, I think, had a lot to do with being a really good manager. And so there's a lot in terms of doing good as like a contributor in probably your first job, you're not managing anybody, to maybe 2 to 5 years into work of like, I actually get to at least manage interns or manage other people. And how do you see somebody, going through their career in terms of rising within one organization and continuing to move forward in their career, hopefully get more meaning out of what they're doing, and then eventually decide, should I stay at this organization versus, am I going to get um, more out of doing something somewhere else?
It's so hard making that decision because I think what happens is, this question of like, should I be doing something else? And I feel like, I don't know, we're of the same vintage. I feel like at this point, kind of early mid 40s, I've had so many more conversations in the last kind of 2 years of people struggling with like, wait a minute, I'm no longer the young up and comer. I'm now, squarely in
Yeah.
my career, squarely in my job. Um, no one's overly impressed by my precociousness. Uh, what am I doing? Like I've now been at this place for 15 years. Am I supposed to still be here? Or am I supposed to leave? I have a mortgage. I have kids. I have other commitments, and it's a really hard question to answer, right? Like, should I stay or should I go? And I think what ends up happening a lot is, this just happened with a friend who got an unsolicited job offer, um and really made her call into question, should I be staying at my current role or should I go after, this other job? Because, my current role is fine, but been here a while and I'm not, setting anything on fire these days. I'm just kind of going to work and doing what needs to be done. Um, and I think what ends up happening in situations like this is we forget to think about, I call this kind of like, your current job is option A, this new job offer is option B. And we often don't think about option C, right? Which is, because this current job offer came in, it's forcing you to examine, should I really be here? Do I want to stay or do I want to go? Um, and often, like, the value of this B job that came in, this unsolicited offer, isn't to go take that job. It's to really think about, am I staying here and committing to where I am? Or do I want to start the quest to find something else and maybe find something that more aligns with my values or is more flexible or, something that I'm more passionate about. Um, and so there isn't, I don't feel like there's a straightforward answer to your question. Maybe I would turn it back to you. Like, how did you think about, hey, I want to make this big jump. I want to make this big leap.
I mean, the thing is that I think for myself, as well as like a lot of other people I've already interviewed for this podcast, in a lot of sense, so many things happen because things don't work out as they planned. So it's like I would love to be able to give people this roadmap of meaning in doing something, but I feel like in so many cases of people I talk to, like they end up where they are now because they were fired, they had something blow up. There was some reason that something happened, and then that was the like kind of hit rock bottom in a way where that kind of forced them to reevaluate. Where I think there's so many things and a lot of kind of what I want to get out of this podcast too, or if I'm like coaching or speaking to someone about it, is like how to not have to go through like the years and years of like trial and error that I went through. And like, how can somebody in a much lower risk way start something? So for me, it's like I had a clothing brand that there were a couple of businesses basically I wanted to raise money for. I was like, or even backing up before that, I graduated from Wharton, got a job in private equity in Latin America, which I thought was like, this is going to be my dream job. Someday I'll create my own fund and do this. And it like got there and I was like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And so it was like partly like not happy with that job. The other thing of like starting, maybe it was like graduating from school or being in a new country, of like, I have all these ideas for businesses. And so, at that point, there was like unhappiness with the current role that kind of led me into starting the first business. And then there were a couple of things that just didn't work out. And then it was like, how do we simplify this? It's like, I don't want to, have to deal with investors. And so the company I have now started out at first as like a marketing agency. Cause as I went through all these startup accelerators, and people would always ask like, how do you do Facebook ads? Or how did you do this? And so it was like people with great ideas, but it's like, how do I get that good idea in front of people? But with my naivete with it, I would say is like managing a bunch of different clients. And if you don't have an expertise where it's like copy and paste and do the same thing for 10 clients, it's like everyone's asking you to do something else. And that's really not into my strengths of like processes and, how to manage all of that. And through all of it, it was like from the clothing brand that I had, we started a YouTube channel. And from that, we like created videos on, so we was like created videos on like how to tie a tie. And it was crazy how all of a sudden, like every Saturday and Sunday, there were like thousands of views for those videos. And you just kind of realize like, oh, you put something up on the internet on YouTube, people search for it and it just like shows up for months later. Eventually with the agency, we were creating content for YouTube, then started making money from that. We're like, this is a lot easier than dealing with clients. And so we made money from YouTube, from affiliate marketing, eventually launched some online courses. And that kind of led to what we were doing. But the transition that I'm kind of making now was like all of those things for that business were basically done to like, how do we make money yesterday? So that's like a very different decision of how you build something versus with this podcast and the other content that I'll be creating of like, how do I provide value? Like, what are the stupid mistakes I've done over the last, long amount of time? And maybe recognizing also some of the things that I've done well. So I think for me of, either being in a really bad situation or just basically talking myself into doing something, for me, like starting something or seeing someone's situation and coming up with like a lower risk way to get started with it is something I feel like I've been able to do very well. But it's like been this like twisting path of like things that just like haven't worked out as I thought, and kind of ending up where I am now, where it's like, okay, the business that pays the bills right now works, but I would like to do something that's more meaningful. And so for me right now, it's a lot of balance between like, how do I keep that from, how do I keep that paying the bills as I build something that is taking a lot of those skill sets into an area that I think is more meaningful. So it's been, a twisting, turning road, and yeah, it's very difficult. And I'd like to be able to help people think through like, how do I do this in kind of that, like what I'm doing now but like have a day job and then like nights and weekends to be able to maybe work on something else that's slowly more meaningful, as opposed to, having to just like rip the Band-Aid off and like move to the other side of the world and be like, okay, I have 18 months of money. Hopefully I figure it out during this time.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things I think with meaning too, is like some of the most meaningful moments in our career and our lives, or those are the ones that were the hardest, right? Like were the ones where we had to overcome the biggest challenge and, or persevere through something that was really difficult. And so kind of I love what you're saying in that, hey, I'm not actually encouraging people to right off the bat, you know, go do this thing that's not going to have any bumps in the road, right? Rather, it's how do you balance, because there are going to be really hard, challenging things that you're going to have to overcome. There are lessons that you can learn from my mistakes, but for most people, right, it's a bumpy path. Even if you land your dream job right off the bat, even if I think of some students of mine who immediately, their first job out of college is they go work to be influencers, right? Because they see the bright lights of what it is, and it's really hard. And they might not stay there, and it's how do you persevere and overcome these challenges, and a lot of meaning happens in those like dark moments, right? Where you have to overcome and you have to your point, like you leave a job, you lose a job, you get fired. Like, how do you come out of that? And that ends up kind of shaping who you are today.
Yeah, one of the interesting things. So I went to the Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within in Germany a couple months ago, and one of the things was that he went through were like the six human needs. So there's certainty. So like I want a paycheck. I want to know that things are going to be the same tomorrow as they were today. There's like uncertainty and variety. So it's like you want new things as well. A big thing for people is significance. So, I want to be an influencer and people are going to leave comments and I'm going to be famous and like I'm going to be so important. Or, my spouse always gives me nice comments or compliments me. There's a lot of ways to get that. And then you have like love and connection. And then those are like the main four. And then you have growth and contribution. And so I think for a lot of people, the two worst ones that most people have are certainty and significance. So I want to feel like I'm important. I'm doing something prestigious. People look up to me when I tell them what I'm doing for work. There's like, oh wow, that you kind of get that reaction, but then you realize over time that like, okay, that's not really what gets me going each day. And so if people can kind of shift more, and that's part of what we did like, well, during the couple of days there was, if you think about it differently, where people ended up instead of significance and certainty was around kind of love and contribution. So if you as an influencer think about how can you add value in other people's lives versus like the look at me and how cool I am, I think it's something that people allows them to continue going forward. And I think finding ways to continue to contribute more. And I think with what you were saying about kind of being our age in our 40s, I think once somebody has 10, 20 years experience and they realize that there's not a clear path of do these next things over the next so many years, is they're gonna like what's next. And so I kind of like exploring the idea of like an encore career. And so like how do I take all the things that I have learned over the last couple of years and how do I make that more meaningful? And so I think it's a little bit tougher for, a 25-year-old who doesn't have a really specific skill set, where, maybe taking a look at your experience, for example, to say, hey, and maybe it happened for you even a little bit earlier where you had all this experience, both before and after the MBA, and then your kind of step back and do something maybe more meaningful was getting the PhD and then kind of your work from there. And obviously it wasn't ending there, but that was kind of the transition in terms of like your encore career, if you will, to find something more meaningful and also use as many of the skills that you've developed previously in what you're doing going forward.
I think I have a couple more encores left in me. But I think something you said I want to bring up, because I think it's really, really important. Kind of these 6 needs that you articulated. And I think the one I see now with Gen Z and where a lot of my students struggle, and like I think students who go into wanting to be an influencer and even wanting to be an entrepreneur. And that's connection and belonging, and kind of the what's lost when you're working alone. I mean, there's so much to be gained, right? But again, back to this, like one of the primary drivers of meaning that we know is kind of close relationships and close friendships, especially at work. And when you're striking out on your own, it's incredibly lonely. And if you're striking out on your own early on and you're kind of right after high school or college, or leaving high school, you might be kind of deprioritizing these deep connections. I even see it with my students who are going into more traditional jobs. They just don't think or don't seem to kind of value these deep, deep, deep connections, which are super important for finding meaning. And so there's, there's that component too. Whenever I think about going into something like being an influencer and being an entrepreneur, it's a real loss, right? And something that you have to make sure that you're cultivating, because it's such a source of meaning, and that you're not going to get from having 20,000 followers, right? Those aren't genuine, authentic connections. And how do you make sure that you have those still front and center when you're kind of pursuing that alternative path?
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I think for most of the stuff I do, it pulls me away from that level of connection. So if I think of my first job in New York in investment banking, there was like a 80-person analyst class. And some of my best friends to this day, what it would be now, 20 some years later, are from that because you suffered together. You worked really late nights together. We went out for drinks afterwards. We went on vacation together, and I've been to a bunch of their weddings. And having that was so meaningful. But there's so many things that go into like the trends of what people want now. So like solopreneurship, or there's going to be $1 billion company with the founder, no employees, and just AI. or, remote work and being a digital nomad. And I think with all of those, like, you really have to be conscious of how to you build connection into that. So I had a mastermind call last night with 5 other entrepreneurs. Um, and it's just, you need things like that where, there's things that I can't talk to my team about. And so it's like, yeah, I work with people and I have calls with them, but it's not exactly the same as, being at a big organization where you have, your bosses, you have people under you, and you have a whole bunch of peers, and you see them every day at the water cooler and go out to lunch to them, and all those different things happen. So I think the people that decide to do some of those things, if it's remote work, being a digital nomad, being a solopreneur, all those things is how do you build that into what you do? So for example, the Paul, the author of the Pathless Path, that's the episode that we're publishing today. One of the things, it's like being around the right group of people. So he was actually leaving consulting. He moved to Asia, and he's an author and has some online courses and a few other things right now. But it was like being around the wrong group of people also isn't helpful. Like, if they're not kind of encouraging you and pushing you and making you better, it was just like they were kind of criticizing him of like, you're over here falling behind. Like, you should be on this direct path, where he was, really going on a different journey. So I think it's, whatever you end up doing, of like being able to surround yourself with peers, a community, a support system. And yeah, a lot of the options for people now, or the cool things to do, kind of forget about that sometimes.
Yeah, I know Paul from, like, I don't know, 7 years ago or 8 years ago, and have followed his have followed his pathless path. So that's awesome that you had a chance to talk to him. And I think, yeah, the idea of this community of, like, genuine, right? I keep coming back to this word, like, genuine and authentic connection. Um, I think is so important for meaning. And I think also, and this is potentially a longer conversation, but the other thing too with AI, it has a huge potential for disrupting what we find meaningful and how we find things meaningful, because of what it does at work. And so what we're seeing is that as we struggle less with tasks, we're just finding less meaning in our work. And so, how do you make sure that you're still able to learn or be challenged? I mean, I see this with my students, right? For me, it's a challenge. How do I make sure my students are challenged in order for them for their assignments to have more meaning? Because AI is so front and center. So it's a totally separate conversation. But when it comes to talking about meaning these days, if we're not looking at the impact of AI, then we're missing a huge part of it, because it's really has the potential to harm, how we find meaning in our day-to-day work.
So why don't we transition a little bit? We talked a lot about kind of what you can do to further your career, but I think a lot of your work is done, trying to help managers and leaders make sure that their team is getting as much meaning as possible, or that they're succeeding in their careers. And so for the entrepreneurs, business leaders, managers, what advice do you have for them to make sure that they're creating the best environment to be able to hire, manage, promote, lead, which, in the end helps them build a much more successful organization?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is, if you're a leader, entrepreneur, CEO, and you have a team, just to realize how much meaning matters to your employees, especially Gen Z. And so we see that once things like, basic working conditions, fair pay, safe work environment, once those are met, kind of the number one thing that employees want in their job is more meaning. And we don't talk about that a lot, right? Like, you've been to a ever been to a leadership training at a big corporation or a small corporation, like, they're not teaching you as a manager, like, hey, here's how you make your team's day more meaningful, right? Like, it just doesn't, even though it is the most important thing that people want, and even more so for Gen Z. So I think the first thing is just to realize how much it matters to people day in and day out. Um, and then I'd say the second thing is And this is part of why I wrote the book, right? Is that, okay, so we realize that it matters a lot. Um, and we know like what allows for more meaning. And we talked about a bunch of that stuff over the last hour, right? So things like having an impact or genuine connections or values. So we know what it is. But then for a manager or a leader, it's like, okay, great. But like, how do I do that? I have like a million things going on. I don't have a lot of resources. I'm managing 8 people. Like, great. But like, give me the practice or like, give me the tool. I was talking with a classmate of ours who and she's a senior person in a tech company, and she's like, yeah, I know my team members want meaning, but like, what am I supposed to do? Like, give them a hug? Like, how do I do this? Right? Like, and she said it kind of half jokingly, because like, how? Right? Like, what's the tactic? And so, in my book, I try to be really practical around like, okay, we know meaning matters. We know this is what drives meaning, and like, here's how to do it. And so for example, one thing you can do as a leader, and I think this is so important for entrepreneurs, especially, is get really good at storytelling. Like when you tell stories and you describe a narrative and you describe the impact, um, it's so powerful and creates a lot of meaning for someone. And so, like the example I use, like if you're trying to motivate your team to take more risks, right? And you say, like, hey, risk taking is so important to be a great company. Companies that take more risks, we see have more innovation and are more successful. So, like, let's all go out and be okay with failure. And your team's like, okay, great. Like, we'll do that. And then they don't do it. Versus you start the meeting by telling a 2-minute story about a time when you massively failed. And maybe the failure resulted in like you getting fired or resulted in you being incredibly embarrassed by what happened, losing a client, right? And so you tell this 2-minute story and then talk about how you kind of picked yourself back up and kept going forward, um, as a way to motivate your team. And then all of a sudden, your team feels so much more connected to you. They really understand why it's important to take risks. It feels personal. It feels meaningful, right? And so that's just one thing we can do is just tell more stories at work. That's going to make people's work more meaningful on a day-to-day basis. Um, so, another tool, for example, is again back to this like helping your team members find their strengths and like really understand what their strengths are. And so what I like to do is have a session where your team members reach out to people around them and have the people around them only give them strength-based feedback. So they're, often when we ask for 360 reviews or things like that, we say, hey, give me some positives, give me some things that are constructive. But in this exercise, have kind of 10 to 15 people jot down like what your strengths are. And your employee is going to get a picture, a beautiful picture about what others perceive their strengths to be. And a lot of times, what we do is we might have a strength that we think is just part of who we are. So we devalue it. But when we hear from 10 people that, I have a strength of empathy. And meanwhile, in my mind, I'm like, well, empathy is just something that I do. So it's who I am. No one cares. Like everyone should be empathetic. But then I hear that that's a strength of mine. Um, that then allows me to think about, okay, this strength is something that's valued and that I can turn into a superpower. How do I bring that into my day to day? And so this idea of having your team members gather their strengths through kind of a 10 to 15 person, exercise, that's going to be an incredible way to create more meaning for your team members. So, I have a whole bunch of other activities, but it's all these little things that managers can do day to day that both ensure that meaning is brought into their day to day and to show their team members that, like, hey, I know that meaning really matters to you. And it's not just on your shoulders to have meaning show up in your work. It's also on my shoulders as a manager. It is one of my responsibilities as a manager to help you find more meaning, as opposed to kind of the place where we started, right? Like, meaning is this solo quest that you're on that one day you'll achieve. It's not that. Your manager and your leader has a whole bunch of responsibility in helping you with that too.
Yeah, I really like that. And so, and then I think probably first for any leader of going through some of the exercises themselves, of like, what am I good at? What do I value? And trying to put that into practice. And then from there to be able to be like, okay, now what can I do to help bring that out in everyone I interact within the organization?
Yeah, and there's really cool research that shows it's like about the transfer of meaning. And so when individuals see their role models, see their leaders, see their managers experiencing meaning, that transfers to them. And so like the best thing you can do as a leader is work on your own daily meaning, because that's then going to transfer over to your employees of, hey, actually this work matters. Hey, it's meaningful. And I can also see that in my own work.
And so for anyone that is feeling stuck right now, so they're not happy with their job, how would you, what would be the process you would tell them to go through in terms of, can I make my current role more meaningful? Do I, maybe I just need a same job, different company. Maybe I should go back to school. Maybe I should become an influencer or move to Bali and kind of figure life out. How would you, like, what would you recommend to that person in terms of the thought process that they should go through?
Yeah. Well, fun fact, in 2012, I did move to Bali to try to figure things out.
Well, why don't we talk
um,
about that a little bit? Because like that's interesting. Of like, because I think the thing is there before we talk about somebody else is I don't know. I feel like that complete step back of like something different is just like a very common theme for somebody to figure out what they want to do versus to just continue on the treadmill and never take a break. So why don't, like, before we get into that, why don't you talk about the time in Bali to find yourself?
yeah. So it was, I was graduating business school. And what happened to me in business school is that I interviewed for a whole bunch of jobs. I explored a whole bunch of roles, and nothing quite felt right. Right. I was like, there's this opportunity here, or there's this. Luckily we graduated in a time when jobs were plenty, right? So it wasn't a matter of not having choice. It's probably in some ways too much choice. But everything I was kind of exploring just didn't quite feel right. And what made it even harder was that everyone around me seemed to know exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to go to the private equity shop. They wanted to go to McKinsey, and they knew what their path was. And what ended up happening was there was this super random internship posted by this company in Bali that was doing projects around carbon offsets and carbon trading. So, a sustainability consulting firm that was working with the UN to figure out kind of early stage carbon trading and carbon offsets. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it's based in Bali? Great. And I remember interviewing with them, this incredible man, Rizal. And he was like, "So you're graduating and you're looking for an internship? Like, I don't quite get it." And I could kind of glossed over that part of like, "Hey, take me as an intern, even though, it's not my intern summer, it's not my intern year." Um, and I was just so excited about being in someplace new. And at that point in my life, like the novelty of location was so important to me. And so I followed that passion, right? I followed the passion of like, wow, I've never been to Indonesia. I've never been to Bali. This seems cool. Let me just do it. Um, and and it was awesome. I'm not gonna, the end of the story isn't like, oh, and I got there and I realized it wasn't paradise and it wasn't, any of those things. It was all of that, right? It was amazing, right? I surfed every morning. I had fresh papaya for breakfast from the local fruit stand, lived in this like incredible little bungalow with another friend, and, walked to work and like biked downtown. And there's this incredible expat community. I mean, it was amazing. Um, and then after about 4 months, I was like, oh, I need something more. Like this isn't, I think it was back to this like challenge. Like I wasn't being challenged enough in that moment. And that goes back to kind of these values of, there was a whole bunch of stuff that it was hitting on, kind of lifestyle and novelty and travel and work that like mattered societally. Uh, but I wasn't being challenged on a day-to-day basis. And I think part of that was coming from business school, or surrounded by just so many people, so many incredibly smart people, uh, and I was in a small, really small organization with, really, really smart people, but a really tiny, tiny, small amount of them. And realized that like I needed to do something a little bit, surrounded by more of that challenge. And it was sad. I remember leaving being like, am I making a massive mistake because I'm so happy here and this is literally paradise? Um and I did. I made a massive mistake in leaving. I took a job in I took a job in Kazakhstan, um doing kind of government reform work, and thought that this was like the job is going to have challenge. It was prestigious. It was paying well, all that kind of stuff. It hit on a bunch of other things. And after 4 months, or actually, after kind of a month, I was like, what did I do? I left paradise and went to Siberia, literally Siberia. Um, what a mistake. And I quit that job, and it was total egg on my face, right? Of like, what did I do? I left something that was wonderful and beautiful and magical. Um, did I leave for the wrong reasons? And I think ultimately, like I didn't leave for the wrong reasons. That next job just wasn't the right one. But I left Bali for the right reasons, and my gut was correct. But it took a while, right, to get back to where, I was supposed to be, and that, and it was embarrassing taking a job and thinking that this is going to be what it was, and then realizing early on, oh, I made a massive mistake. Like this was a mistake. What do I do now? Um, and so, then one thing led to another, and ultimately got to where I wanted to be. But I'm all for the move to Bali, surf on the beach, be around incredible people. And I'm still close to some of the folks I met there. And it was an amazing experience. And so I'm a huge advocate of that.
And so, getting back to the person who feels stuck, what would be the
Oh
steps
yeah.
that sorry,
Your
I
original
like that
question.
detour, but what would you recommend for that person who has a 9 to 5 job that maybe they're not so happy with? What would be the things that they should think about before making any drastic move? Let's say.
Yeah. So my first recommendation would be, make a list of 5 people whose jobs or careers that you envy. And we all have those people in our life, right? Like the friend who are like, oh my gosh, that person's job just seems so cool, or I'd love to do what this person's doing. And have kind of a have 5 conversations with people about what they do, uh, and start to really hone in on, why do you feel stuck in your job and what's missing? And then it becomes a question of, okay, well, can I get what's missing in my current role? Is it just about kind of something as simple as like reframing? Or is it reshaping my role? Or is it finding a role, another role in the organization? Or maybe it's something more drastic. But I would start from the place of like, go out and talk to people. Because I think one of the things we don't do enough of is really interrogating what other people do in their day to day. I had a friend who had this incredible job, um, that she kind of flew all over the world, right? And so when I was kind of loved to travel, she's just like had this super cool job where she was flying all over the world. She's flying business class, these planes, and I was just like, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. I'm so jealous, right? Like of this role, making a lot of money doing it, all this kind of stuff. And then I'm like, have I ever asked her what she's doing day to day? Like, what is her moment to moment? And that's what really drives our meaning and our happiness is not the not what's on paper, but like what are you doing between 10 and 11 on a Wednesday morning every week? Like that's what's going to drive what really matters. And so anyway, back to that question is if you're stuck, the first thing I would do is go out and talk to kind of 5 to 10 people about what do they actually do in their job, so that you can really understand what's missing in your work, and then how do you go out and find that.
One of the things I always ask people to think about is like, what does their ideal day look like? And so I think that that's something versus like, yeah, it's something that's like this beautiful ideal. But then I really like the idea of just interviewing people that that you think maybe have that life, and then figuring out if it's truly that way or not. But I think that, yeah, if your random Tuesday is your ideal life, then you don't have to wait till Friday evening to get off work. But yeah, finding that daily basis of what would something look like that's achievable for me, I think is really good. And so for somebody that wants to find out more about your work, where should they go?
So I have a Substack, Bringing Up the Boss, where I started as weekly, now monthly, now probably bi-monthly tips and tricks around how to be a great manager. Also, you can, my website, rachelpacheco.com, has resources and links to books and videos, where you can find out more information.
Amazing. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.